Hello everyone, Ace here, and today I've decided to answer a rather important question in regards to video game history. Specifically, what exactly made The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past great? First released way back in 1991, and often considered one of the finest games ever made in the iconic Legend of Zelda franchise, it's quite safe to say that A Link to the Past has made such a name for itself that it still remains both well-remembered and beloved by the fans to this very day. But to understand why this is the case, it's important to look at the qualities and features that made A Link to the Past stand out amongst its peers at the time. And the first quality that I believe is important to look at is the fact that A Link to the Past is one of the first open-world games to truly have a heavy amount of dialogue in it, while at the same time not being a role-play game. Which may sound like a rather specific feat to accomplish, and that's because ultimately it is. However, it should be noted that by being successful in this particular regard, A Link to the Past was able to demonstrate that more arcadey open-world games could still benefit significantly from having more world building. A lesson that the video game industry as a whole has clearly taken to heart in the time since. But it should also be noted that this particular innovation directly led to another feature that truly made A Link to the Past great, and that being the storytelling elements that the game introduced into the franchise that became commonplace afterwards. Story elements such as the Master Sword, as well as there being multiple parallel-like worlds, were ultimately introduced first into this game. And given that these are ideas that ultimately have shaped the franchise for the past 30 years, it's easy to see their importance on video game history. And speaking of how A Link to the Past has managed to shape the history of video games, let's now move on to the impact that the game, as well as the console that it was on, had on that entire console generation. That being the transition of consoles trying to emulate arcade machines, to instead consoles increasingly trying to compete with the PC gaming market. Younger gamers may not remember this, but originally back in the 80s, the console's main competition came in the form of the arcade games that you would actually find in malls, with those arcade machines having a number of advantages in their own right, such as having specialized control schemes, as well as better visuals and sound. By the late 80s and early 90s, however, there had been significant leaps in technological development that especially benefited the console market. But arguably, the most important innovation was not one of technology, but rather the idea that video games on consoles could be far more story-focused than their arcade cabinet counterparts. A mindset that A Link to the Past ultimately proved to be fruitful, but at the same time also began a shift in focus, which ultimately meant that video games on consoles were increasingly going to be competing with video games on PC instead, a change whose impact can be felt to this very day. And while it was a slow process that took many years, it can certainly be argued that A Link to the Past is one of the first games to make that change a reality. And given, in retrospect, the sheer amount of impact that this particular entry has had in video game history, I hope you'll agree when I say that The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past is great.